I didn't realize until after I filmed literally the whole show that I didn't have my star on. In the meantime, Black Love. I'm so upset. So I need you to do me a small favor. Just pretend that I was wearing it the whole time. Thank you. This is unusual, but I actually want to start today's episode on a personal note. I am always flattered when people think I'm a native New Yorker because what could be more glamorous? But I actually am a transplant. Life brought me to Harlem before I knew where I was headed, but when I look back, everything in my life was leading to this. In the third grade, after everyone had learned their multiplication facts, and for the record, I learned mine first, I got it out the way early. But once we all learned our facts, our teacher did a movie party for us, and she showed us the movie The Wiz. I'll tell y'all more about her in another episode, but I was obsessed with that movie. Diana Ross's Dorothy was from Harlem. She'd never gone below 125th Street, and I decided in that moment, I must go there. I must stay above 125th Street. I want to be where Dorothy was. When we lived overseas, we had military cable, which is not like regular cable. We got a lot of reruns, and one particular rerun that we got was of a talent show where people were rubbing pieces of wood for good luck, and there, if you did a bad job, there would be someone sweeping you off the stage called the Sandman. And I asked my mom to take me to this magical place, the Apollo Theater, and I asked her, what would you do if I won? If I do my Jackson 5 impersonation, Dancing Machine, what are you going to do if I win? She never answered that question. When I was in high school, I actually won state level poetry competitions and went to nationals by reciting poetry by Langston Hughes. All the pieces that I chose were from his Madam collection, Madam and the Phone Bill, Madam and the Census Man, and I loved reanimating his work and playing this sharp-tongued, very sassy woman while everybody else was reading Walt Whitman, Robert Frost, or whoever. Mine was something different, right? Mine felt like something very special. When I moved to the city to go to Columbia, they put me in housing on 123rd Street and Morningside Drive. So I was right at the top of the park. And in orientation, they actually warned us. They'll probably tell you they didn't, but they did. They said the campus was in Morningside Heights, but if I crossed the park, I was then technically in Harlem, and I should be careful, or at least just, be vigilant, be aware of your surroundings. All those things that people say when what they mean is be careful. So the first Saturday I lived there was a cookout in the park, and I could smell the food and hear the music through my window. And I was like, oh, it must be a holiday. Eventually, I'd realized that every Saturday in Harlem is a holiday. And I wanted to go. I wasn't going to eat their food, but I just wanted to go, be in the mix. But I stayed inside. And I didn't go any further into Harlem besides the A train stop at 125th Street. And I spent my social time downtown. And that lasted for about a week. Sometime in my second week, I go to what's basically been described to me as the Shadowlands. And I realize that I'm actually everywhere the light touches. I'm in the middle of 125th Street. They yelling about cash for gold. I'm smelling oils. Maybe incense that I've never smelled before. It's such a particular fragrance. And I know I'm messing up the flow of traffic on the sidewalk, but it's there. I am staring dead at the Apollo Theater, the place I've dreamed of my whole life. And I realize that I'm here. I am here. I had a moment. And I realized I would go on to unlearn a lot of the things that that they taught me at Columbia. But I have loved Harlem since before I ever lived here. And I admit that I moved here like kind of on a subconscious level, but I admit that I did it because of its history. The Renaissance, which I learned about in school and which I followed up on with my own reading, it seemed to be this glamorous time of artistic expression and liberated lifestyle where anything was possible. And I imagined the diner scene from the musical Rent, but like with an all Black cast. That was how I saw the Harlem Renaissance in my mind. By the time I got to Harlem, about 90 years too late, like I'm often late for stuff, but 90 years is definitely a record. All that remained was the sidewalks. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, I love knowing that I'm walking on the same street that they did when they headed to the salon at 306. I love that I'm walking into the same libraries where they held meetings, or that I'm having a drink in the brownstone that Langston Hughes called home, or that I took the same A train from the Duke Ellington song. Whether it's happening now or it already happened, it's an energy that I feel when I'm here. I can't speak for you. I feel it. I'm talking about me. When things were tough at Columbia, when I was sick of the ivory tower and the Ivy League and the respectability and the microaggressions, and we won't even get into the assumption of affirmative action, but I would cross the park and go to the place where I felt safest, where I didn't have to carry anybody on my back, where I could just be. And to a certain extent, while I was hypervisible on Columbia's campus, I was nearly invisible in Harlem. I was just another person on the sidewalk. So when I graduated and I snatched that degree, I finally closed the gap between me and my happy place because I got an apartment dead in the center of Harlem so that I could come home and be at home every single day. And it's a beautiful thing. I say all this to say that I went into this show about the Harlem Renaissance with a certain set of expectations and with a sincere wish to be fully transported, taken back in time to a place that I inhabit in the present to get a taste of what it was like in the past. I'm Anastasia X, and I love art almost as much as I love Black people, so I started a YouTube channel to shine a light on Black artists and creatives. I named it Black Star Reviews, and I'm so very happy that you're here. Today I'm reviewing the Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism, currently on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, curated by Dr. Denise Murrell. Even though I felt safe in Harlem, there were a few things I had to put my big girl panties on for. And one of those things was getting my hair braided. Growing up, my mom braided my hair, so the idea of going to a braiding salon, this was a big hurdle for me. I did overcome. Y'all would be proud of me. But I have this very meta memory of getting my hair braided. I used to go to this shop on Fifth Avenue between 125th and 126th. There's like 3 braiding shops on that block now, and I couldn't even tell you which one it was. But I was in the chair, and I was reading Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And as I'm reading the book, getting my hair braided, the character in the story is getting her hair braided. And I was like, wow, the synchronicity. But I loved that book. I absolutely devoured it. And then I was trying to get my little mitts on anything that Chimamanda had written because I realized that I knew so little about the African experience. And it opened up so many questions for me. So I was looking for more African authors. And the more I read, the larger my list of questions got. But I read some of Helen Oyeyemi. I read Yagiasi's Homecoming, which is one of my favorite books to this day. I'm always telling people the story about Abina and bringing the water for the plants, which is, I'll save that for another video. And nearly every African author that I read referenced this guy, Chinua Achebe. Now, when I looked up his work, it was described as an African hero story. And the idea of an African hero story did not appeal to me because I don't like hero stories as much as I like shiro stories. I really like stories about women. But when I finally decided to get into that book, I fell in love with it. And I realized that I should stop being so stubborn when people that I love give me recommendations of books that I might like, because they're probably going to be right. So we are dedicating today's episode to Chinua Achebe, and we're going to pour some out for him. Now, Chinua Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart in 1958, and it was a groundbreaking novel at the time. I think in many ways, still groundbreaking. But here's a quick resume if you're unfamiliar with Chinua's work. Nelson Mandela read Chinua Achebe while in prison. First resume bullet point. Second resume bullet point, Toni Morrison said he sparked her love affair with African literature, which is the highest praise you can receive as a writer. If Toni Morrison is reading you, retire. You've done it. There is no higher peak than that. And he was bestowed with the title of Father of African Literature, which he rejected. Now, pay attention. The idea here is this title implies that the genre of African literature began with him, that he, in 1958, was the first to create literature for an entire continent. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? That he was the first legitimate peer to the West. This is obviously ludicrous. So Achebe said, no, y'all not calling me that. Because in his eyes, the approval of the West was not what justified his work. And I wholeheartedly, every fiber of my being, agrees with that. So the ability to acknowledge the people and the ideas that came before you, it's key. Knowing your history is key to be able to embody Sankofa, to go back and fetch it. All key. So both Achebe and Alain Locke, who we will discuss in the next segments, they both knew how to draw from their pasts to create and inspire works that would move people in the present, their present, which is now our past. But both of them taught us to be in community and not separate from the people, and to seek validation from within. So my deepest thanks to Chinua Achebe and his contributions to the diaspora. We dedicate this episode to you. I had to get deep into the research with this one because this is a story that I wanted to tell correctly. Y'all know I love Harlem. There's a lot riding on this for me. I want this review to be so on point that whether you go see the show or not, you can really engage with its legacy and understand the importance of this moment culturally in our collective consciousness. I try not to read other people's reviews before I do my own because I want to make sure that my opinions are pure and they're not swayed by other people who I might sometimes feel are smarter, right, or more well-versed than I am. So I try to keep the earmuffs on until after I post my review. So the information that I used for research, and I'm sharing this with you so that we can build some trust, it came from obituaries and op-eds. It was the only place I could get information about what happened in the past that wasn't tainted by present day. So I really had to get into my primary source bag, and I want to shout out all the history teachers. So let's go back to 1969. And I'm going to tell you a few things that happened in 68 so we can really set the scene. 1968, Dr. King has been assassinated. The Civil Rights Act has been passed. There is a war going on in Vietnam. The Olympics were held in Mexico City, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos held up the Black Power sign when they received their medals. This is the cultural context of the time when the Met in New York City puts up Harlem on My Mind. So the lead curator is white, and he's up and coming, and it should be noted that he is working with a team of Black people. It should also be noted that one person who witnessed the show at the time, one of my primary sources, said, and I quote, "I'd never seen an art show so much like a science museum display." Y'all been to the Museum of Natural History, and there's like people in boxes, like mannequins of primitive people making fires, right? Or scraping a bowl or something like that. And you go and you look at them and you're like, oh, that's what it was like. There were no literal people in boxes at the Met's Harlem show in 1969, but it felt like an observation of people rather than an artistic survey. There were photographs of life in Harlem, but there was no actual art, no painting, no sculptures. The people on the curator's team advised that he include work by Black artists and sculptors, but he said, another quote, "It was not intended to be a fine art show," and he proceeded on. So the Black fine artists obviously felt excluded, and they formed the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition. Great name. And this group included Romare Bearden, who we will circle back to later on in this show. So the artists, the BECC, they're protesting outside the show at the Met. Remember, the show is titled Harlem on My Mind. They have these signs that ask, Harlem on whose mind? Which is really the perfect question because it gets at the idea of gaze, G-A-Z-E. For whose gaze was this show created? Whose gaze is to be satisfied by this show? Is it the people of Harlem? Is it the people who lived through the Renaissance, like Romare Bearden? Or is it for the white gaze, the illustrious white gaze? The BECC felt like anybody could get it. They were protesting outside of the Met. They also had some smoke for the Whitney and the MoMA too. They were even protesting outside of the curator's home, to the point the man left the city and took his family and moved to Vermont. If you can believe it, besides the lack of fine art and the protests, there were other issues. The catalog was written by a literal high schooler. I am not exaggerating. A literal high school student wrote the catalog for the show. And then nobody edited it, which meant it was published with anti-Semitic language. The mayor read it and said, "You take this down now. You take down this catalog." And they had to pull the catalog at the mandate of the mayor. That is bananas. And that's the saga of the 69 show at the Met, Harlem on My Mind. Now in 1987, the Studio Museum would put up its show, Harlem Renaissance, Art of Black America. And I have the catalog. I actually got this from a neighbor who was moving. She was like, "You want this?" I said, "Yes." And then, bam, I had it when it was time to do this filming. But this show is considered truly the standard in Renaissance exhibitions. But opinions eventually shifted about the 1969 show. In 1995, they reissued the catalog for the 69 show. They got someone who wasn't a high schooler to write it. And in the foreword by Henry Louis Gates and also some writers at the Schomburg, they remembered the 69 exhibition as the first of its kind, as groundbreaking, yada, yada, yada. So this show, Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism, it's 2024. We have a new curator, a new director, a new time. But even though it's 50 years later, it's the same institution. And they can't possibly disconnect themselves from their unfortunate shadow. So the curator, Dr. Denise Murrell, who is a Black woman, she has a big job. Really, 4 big jobs. First, she's working for the institution to right their wrongs, the wrongs from 69. She's working for the artists to ensure their just due on one of the biggest platforms in the art world. She's working for the audiences to feel reflected accurately and respectfully, meaning they won't walk in and feel like it's a science museum. And she's working to honor the legacy of Alain Locke, the father of the new Negro Movement, which would eventually become known as the Harlem Renaissance. So now that you have a sense of the legacy, let's talk about what's actually on view right now. This show has more than 160 pieces and is divided into 13 sections. Let's contrast that with some of the other museum shows I've seen recently. Giants at the Brooklyn Museum Art from the Dean collection has over 100 pieces divided into 3 sections. Creative Sources, the Spike Lee exhibition, also at the Brooklyn Museum, had more than 450 works divided into 7 sections. So that means that this show is not the largest one that I've seen recently in terms of number of works, but it is the one with the most distinct sections. The 13 sections are Number 1, the thinkers. 2, everyday life. 3, portraiture and the modern Black subject. 4, debate and synthesis, African and Western aesthetics. 5, a language of artistic freedom. 6, cultural philosophy and history painting. 7, the new Negro artist abroad, Motley in Paris. 8, European modernism and the international African diaspora. 9, luminaries. 10, nightlife. 11, family and society. 12, artists as activists. 13, coda, the block. Let's work backwards and discuss selected highlights. I'm not going through all 13. Number 12, artists as activists. This section includes images of responses to violence and brutality, and it's reminiscent of the conversations that we are still having today. Important conversations that are worth having, and we should keep talking about it until it's not a problem anymore. But when people say they don't want to be seen as Black artists, I'm always tempted to remind them that the world sees them as Black, whether they like it or not. So we might as well link up in the struggle and work on this together. Your work will be politicized simply because you as a Black artist made it. So you might as well take it all the way and say something poignant. Number 10, nightlife. I want to read y'all this quote by Romare Bearden for the nightlife section. He said, 3 nights a week, we were at the Savoy Ballroom. Charlie Buchanan, who ran the place, liked artists to come to the Savoy. The best dancing in the world was there and the best music. When we left the Savoy, we'd go to the after-hours spots. They called us the Dawn Patrol. Now, what did I told y'all in the Jelly's Last Jam episode that they were stomping at the Savoy all night long. And I just want Romare Bearden to know, I am carrying on your legacy with the Dawn Patrol. Don't you worry, Dawn Patrol is in great hands. We keeping it up. Number 9, luminaries. So this section, to me, marks the beginning of the export of Black talent and culture as profitable. I am not including slavery in this timeline. I am starting here. This section highlights artists who went overseas to find fame and respect as a singer or an actor. So you can see pictures of Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, and more in this section. Number 8, European modernism and the international African diaspora. What a mouthful. This is where you can see works by European artists depicting Black subjects or incorporating elements of the jazz age into their work. And this should be noted that it's one of the curator's specialties. She has an emphasis on Matisse, so there are a few pieces by Matisse in there and Picasso as well. Number 7, the Negro artist abroad. So you have these artists that went abroad for acceptance, but I want to push back on that a little bit because we find that it's not so much acceptance as it is toleration, temporary fascination, possible fetishization. These people could exhibit in galleries. They could receive applause, be invited to parties, hobnob with aristocrats, but their pieces were not added to the permanent collections of these European museums. And I think we see a parallel in the story of Baldwin. Baldwin went abroad to France to escape racism, and he found joy while he was there. But when Baldwin died, the French saw no value in maintaining the house where he created his art. It is a temporary acceptance. It is temporary approval. And put a pin in that because we will come back to it in the My Thoughts section. Skip to number 4, debate and synthesis, African and Western aesthetics. This section is fascinating because it explores 2 questions that the artists were asking themselves then and that I think many people still ask themselves now. Or I'll speak for myself. I still ask these questions now. The first one, is African art Black art? Are we as Black Americans entitled to African aesthetics? Now, even as a non-artist, I wonder about this. There's a jewelry brand that I love called Omi Woods, and it's where I got my cowrie shell that I wear every day. I never take it off. It helps me to channel abundance. In addition to making cowrie shells, they also make jewelry of Adinkra symbols and coins of diasporic countries. So if a Black country achieved independence, she has got a coin for their Independence Day. Now, when I told the jewelry designer how much I loved the coins, but as a person with no direct tie to an African country or a Caribbean nation, that I felt unsure, like, can I purchase, can I wear this? She said, you can buy and wear whatever you want. Like, who's going to stop you? But I have always leaned more towards the Pan African designs, a cowrie shell, right? An ankh, because there's always this question for me: what's the line between African and Black? And how can we build intentional connections between these groups? I don't want to alienate anyone with the jewelry that I choose, but I do want to be able to honor my heritage. The second question: which is more respectable, including Western motifs or African motifs? And this actually lends itself to a phenomenon I notice in Black history that I call being out progressed. Here's what I mean. So you have Booker T. Washington, up from slavery. He said, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, serve your country. And then you have Du Bois coming up behind him, who said, take the boots off, read a book, become a teacher, save the youth, attend to your soul. Now, Du Bois outprogressed Washington, but Du Bois would get outprogressed by Locke. Du Bois was still using Western-inspired art in the NAACP publications because that was high culture to him. Locke was using more African-inspired art in his writings and the books that he was putting out. Those two made their choices between those two options. But this section of the show actually gives us a third choice: Black American art. It's the combination of technical mastery with a Black subject. That's an oversimplification, but it's just one version of what Black American art can look like. And a non-Harlem Renaissance example of what I mean is Barclay Hendricks' piece, Lottie Mama, which I saw at the Madison Frick less than a year ago. So this piece echoes the Italian Renaissance style. Now, why technical mastery is associated only with the West pains me, but I'm not going to go there right now. Section 3, Portraiture and the Modern Black Subject. My favorite part of this section was the naming conventions, the names that the artists had chosen for their works. See if you notice a theme. Girl in red dress, girl with pomegranate, woman in blue, man in vest, girl in green cap. Section 2, Everyday Life in Black Cities. This section had a lot of photography by James Van Der Zee, which often was courtesy of HBCUs and the Schomburg, right down the street in Harlem, and it depicts things like parading. Having been Black all my life, I'm wondering about the cultural significance of parades for Black Americans. I would be very curious about the link between parades, pageants, ballroom culture, Soul Train lines, and fashion shows. And I mean the fashion shows like the ones we used to have in college, not the high fashion ones. At Black fashion shows, often it's more about the model and less about the clothes. But what is it about us lining up on either side of someone who's commanding space, commanding gaze, commanding attention? There's got to be a root to that. Somebody should research it, or if the research has already been done, maybe one of you can send me a link. We're all the way full circle to section 1, the thinkers. When I launched Black Star Reviews and I said that I was going to be reviewing museum exhibitions, artwork, and plays, people asked, well, why don't you just focus on one? Why don't you just do plays, or why don't you just do museum shows? And the reason why I don't focus on one is because to me, it feels like hearing only one part of the conversation. We can't tell the story of the Harlem Renaissance without writers. And so that's why I think it's important to make sure that we're looking at work as it happens in the orbit, in its time. We can't tell the story of the Harlem Renaissance without Langston Hughes, but he has not a lick of visual art in the show. Section 1, Thinkers, is also where you can very clearly see what I like to call the Harvard-Howard pipeline. You had these scholars who graduated from Harvard, fully qualified to teach anywhere, but their options were limited to Black schools. And I have mixed feelings about this because as an HBCU graduate, I'm so grateful that these people are a part of our academic legacy. At the same time, I realize that they may have felt frustrated by the limitation that they could only work in these institutions, and also frustrated at the possibility that they were competing with very close friends over very limited number of jobs. So I'm happy, but I wish I could sit down and talk with them about really how that felt for them. So over all these 13 sections, Murrell indicates that the show's aim is to make clear the influence of the Harlem Renaissance on the modernism movement and to establish African American art as American art. Now, I thought we proved that point already. Maybe I'm tripping. Maybe we need to say it louder for the people in the back. This was the point that Alain Locke was always trying to make. And so I went back and read the essay that started it all, his essay entitled The Legacy of Ancestral Arts. And as I was reading it, my first thought was, people just don't write like this anymore, like such style, such flourish. And I miss this. We need more readers so that people will write again. But the essay discusses how, at the time he wrote it, that African art had gone from being seen as crude, like, basic, simple, to being appreciated for the mastery that it depicts. And people were writing about how the sculptors had complete control of the plastic, of the medium, which often was wood. He uses this example of a shift in permissibility and acceptance to make the case that Black people, by virtue of their genetics, have inherited a deep-seated aesthetic endowment, which basically just means that the art is inside of you, it's in your genes. So he's saying that if you combine that endowment with the uniquely American experience of being Black in this country, then they will be able to create a style that is truly their own. They can build on the legacy of ancestral arts with something new, something that is at once African and American, something Negro, something new Negro. So while Locke was, as we say today, unapologetically Black, he also believed that building cross-racial unity would be the key to these artists making progress in their careers. And Locke held artists who broke the color line in very high esteem. So this included Rice, a German painter who created the portrait of him that we most often look to when we think of Alain Locke. He had a lot of respect for Matisse, who created a painting of a Black woman that you can see in the show, as well as a painting of a Black woman sitting very close to a white woman, like so close that it would have been an issue at the time it was painted. And like I said, you can see both of these pieces in the show. You can see all 13 sections, all 160 plus pieces of art, and read a number of fabulous quotes throughout these rooms in the Met. So I don't know how long this episode will be by the time I finish recording and editing it, but it is not lost on me that Dr. Denise Murrell gets 160 pieces in like 6 rooms, and I'm trying to review all of that in under 45 minutes. So I am going to keep it tight with the thoughts. I have about 5 and then 1 bonus thought that really doesn't count. We're going to call that thought 0. Thought 0 is that this show felt big. The sections overlapped. There was some focus on artists, some focus on themes, and it was difficult to find an overarching narrative. So, as an example, there were photos in everyday life that could have been in family and society. Motley had his own section, but he was not the only artist to have gone abroad. And as a writer, I wanted a little bit more of a story to be told, whether it was chronologically or thematically or even grouped by style and medium. But I am releasing the idea of needing to control everything and releasing the idea that everything needs to make sense all the time. And so that's why I'm calling this Thought 0, because it doesn't count. This is something I need to work on, but I'm saying it in case you share this with me. But suffice it to say, you will need a lot of time and potentially multiple visits to take all of this in. And that's part of the reason why I'm posting my review in mid to late March for a show that opened at the end of February. It's just taken time to see the work, engage with it, sit with it, do the research, and try to honor the effort that has gone into this collection. Thought number one, let's talk about the name. Renaissance is on everyone's tongues because of the Beyonce summer that we just had. And Beyonce has helped everyone, even the vocabulary challenged among us, to learn that Renaissance means rebirth. Now, when it's used in reference to the movement, the Harlem Renaissance, it's actually a callback to the Italian Renaissance. So the Italian Renaissance is a time period when there was all kinds of creativity and art being churned out. There was literature, there was visual art. It was sandwiched between the Dark Ages and modernity, modern times. For anyone curious, we are no longer in modern times. We're in what's called postmodern times because we've seen what modernity has gotten us, and we just have a few notes. But the Italian Renaissance was a reawakening because remember, Italy contains Rome, and Rome at one point was seen as the global hotspot for culture. But then there was the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and then woo, Italy is back, baby, right? Molto bene, all that. So the Harlem Renaissance is not named Harlem Renaissance because Harlem came back to life. It's named this because it was such a flashpoint. It was reminiscent of the Italian Renaissance. It was a timely convergence of big-time creative production. At the time the Harlem Renaissance was actually happening, it was called the New Negro Arts Movement. I feel like it's important to know that because this exhibit feels like a Renaissance in a more literal sense. The viewer is being reminded and reawakened to the very magical stuff that happened within a 50-block radius about 100 years ago. The artists are not reborn. We are. One thing I wanted from the show was to make that connection clear. The artists of today, Black American artists, specifically have continued the legacy of the new Negro artists. Whether their work includes African motifs or Western motifs, or it has a Black subject or depicts a Black story, there is a precedent that has been set. And I would have loved to see more of the Harlem works in conversation with modern works, like a Bisa Butler quilt across from or next to a James Van Der Zee photograph, which leads to my second thought. The curator made an effort to honor Locke by integrating the exhibit. Locke wanted new Negro artists being discussed at the same level of the artists that they helped influence. When he curated shows, he brought artists of different races together, and people didn't always like this. There were some critics. But what strikes me is that we're often the ones who have to actually do the integration. The onus is always on us. In a show about Harlem Renaissance, you include a Matisse. But in the Matisse show, will you include a Motley? When it was time to integrate the schools, we had to be bussed clear across town. Call Kamala, she'll tell you about it. And the white children stayed exactly where they were. The best way that we can honor Locke, in my opinion, is to integrate all of the shows. But I have a feeling that Monet Degas, which recently ended at the Met to great acclaim, did not include any Black artists who were also working at that time period. So I'm wondering, are we not yet tired of accommodating everyone else in an effort to justify what doesn't need justification? Are we not yet tired of waiting to be on the cover of Vogue when we've already graced the cover of Essence? We set ourselves up for disappointment and rejection when we hold up whiteness and white work and white standards as the bar that we must reach. We can free up our mind's capacity and literal wall space in this exhibit by releasing ourselves from this desire to convince the white mind, which leads me to my third point. This show is coming down in July, and part of that is because the art has to go back home. These pieces don't belong to the Met. They don't live on the Upper East Side. They're on view courtesy of the Schomburg and of Hampton and Howard and Fisk and Clark Atlanta. These are the institutions that saw value in Black art, that saw value in Renaissance artists before it was in vogue. And this is why I shout out HBCUs every chance that I get, because they believed in us first. I want to circle back to a point I made in the summary. One of the notes in the new Negro Artist Abroad section discussed how these artists went overseas for respect and acclaim, and they found it. But the galleries that displayed their work didn't add them to the permanent collection because they didn't see value there. But HBCUs did. We have to support the HBCUs so that they can continue to do this great work. So that when larger, more prominent institutions like the Met come knocking because they want to do an exhibition, that there's actually something in good enough condition to display. So next time you're on campus for homecoming, take a moment to go to your campus gallery. And if you're not going back to homecoming, send the school a check. On the real though, I'm really not playing with y'all. Send a check to an HBCU. If you don't want to support a specific school, you can donate to the HBCU Poisson Scholarship, which helps students from all over the nation attend and graduate from the HBCU of their choice. I will put the link down below. Send your school some money. Help them to continue buying and restoring and maintaining the art that they have and purchasing art from Black artists who are working right now. And of course, I want to shout out the Hampton University Museum collection, which had 4 pieces on view in this show. It was such a pleasure to see my school's name every once in a while when I was reading the little plaques. Fourth, I was so in love with all of the callbacks in this show, and while there were many, I will just share 2 here. First, so remember Romare Bearden helped lead this charge in the protest against Harlem on My Mind at the Met in 1969. So as a Black artist from Harlem, I can only imagine how offended he felt by the fact that the show included not a lick of art by anyone that he called a friend or a mentor. In contrast to the 1969 show, the 2024 show ends with his work. And it answers that question of Harlem on whose mind because it looks and feels like the neighborhood. It's done with love. It's done with closeness. It's done in community. And so we've come full circle and we've healed a wound with Coda. The second callback is in the cover art for the show. What I mean by cover art is the one that's on the cover of the catalog. It's hanging outside of the institution. It's in all the press. It's on the website. And the cover art that they chose is by William H. Johnson. So the Studio Museum's Harlem Renaissance show used Johnson's man in a vest for their cover shot. You've been looking at him the whole time. Murrell also used a Johnson piece called Woman in Blue, which is on loan from Clark Atlanta. So I love that these 2 shows are in conversation with each other. Those little tidbits, that effort to incorporate Sankofa, to connect with the stories that came before, that is what I love about Black art. That is what I love about legacy. That is why I do Black Star reviews. Confession, I spent way too much money on merch at this show. I was just supposed to get postcards, but I ended up buying a book and a silk scarf, and they priced it like I'm paying for real silk, which remains to be seen. I touched it. I was like, really? This is the price? But I obviously bought it anyway, so who am I to complain? But I loved the children's book that I bought. It's titled What Was the Harlem Renaissance, and it's from the Who Was series. It is written by Sherry L. Smith, and I read it in about 10 minutes because it's a children's book. There are many things I appreciated about this beautiful book. Little me would have lost her mind over this. Like, it would have been worn out because she would have read it over and over and over again. The thing I want to mention about this book here, and I'll leave it alone, is rarely do we discuss how the Renaissance came to an end. I couldn't blame you if you assumed that the Renaissance died with Langston, or that it came crashing down with the stock market, or that we went from stomping at the Savoy to picking out our hair to wear afros and berets and join the Panthers. Smith writes that times got hard, white money and interest ran thin, and it was time to pull a Booker T, put them boots on. I'm editorializing, she doesn't say it like that. But as it was happening, the new Negro movement had little to no impact on the everyday Negro. If you weren't an artist or a patron or in some way connected to the arts, you may not have even known that you would end up in a photograph in a museum exhibition 100 years later. Maybe you worked as a perfume girl in a department store and you went to go see an Elks parade on your day off, and click, you're trapped forever in this picture of a moment in time. Now, Locke admitted that people in the movement could have done more to involve the everyday Negro and to invite them in. So I have to ask myself if this show has done that. Are the descriptions inviting for a first-time viewer? Does including Matisse invite or alienate? Is the show curated in a way that would make the average Black person feel that this is their history, that they have a cultural tie to this? Is the press for this show reaching our whole community or just the ones of us who read the Times and the New Yorker? I don't have an answer, and I have no desire to point any fingers at anybody at the Met, least of all Dr. Murrell, who clearly put a lot of work and research into making this show a reality. But I hope, as I'm trying to do by putting this on YouTube, which is the most accessible place on the globe that I know of, I hope that we're calling everyone in and that we're calling everyone home. Parade style drum roll, please. I am giving Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism 4 Black stars. I felt it was wide-ranging, thoughtfully curated. It honors Locke's legacy, and it adds another chapter, a much better chapter, to the story of the Met's depiction of Black Americans, Black American artists, and Black American art. However, I still wanted a clearer tie to the present. What does this show mean for us as Black Americans and Americans today? Where would I go after the show? Get off the Upper East Side. Hop on the bus, go up to Harlem, you're only a few blocks away, and try room 623. It's a jazz speakeasy, and I think after seeing the show, going to this speakeasy, it'll feel almost like you're in a time machine, like you went back to the Renaissance, like Langston and Claude McKay might walk in at any moment. Who would I take to the show? Everybody. But for real, take people who can stand up for long periods of time, people who don't mind walking. I told you the show is big, so take somebody with some stamina. People who can take in a lot of information. People who can chart their own course. Because the show is so far-reaching, don't take somebody who's going to want to look at every single piece. They'll never get out of there. Take somebody who's going to say, I think I just want to focus on James Van Der Zee for this visit. Or I just want to do a cursory glance. I just want to do like a quick survey. If you take somebody who's going to look at every single piece, block off 8 hours because that's how long it's going to take. You're going to get there when the museum opens and they're going to be kicking you out at the close, and your guest probably still hasn't finished looking at all the art and reading all the little signs. The show is up until July 28th when the art has to go back home to Hampton and all of the other places that donated. So make a point to mark your calendar and take time to go see this show. I would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, if you go see it as a result of having watched my review, that would mean the world to me. So if you tag me when you post about it, I would love to put a like and leave you a comment. But you can also comment on this video or even on my social media to let me know what you thought about this review or what you thought about the show. Let's have a conversation. If you haven't already, which if you haven't, like, what are you waiting for? Follow me on TikTok. There's behind the scenes footage. There's mini reviews. There's lots of fun stuff. And you should definitely be following me on Instagram because that's where you find out when the new videos drop. So in addition to subscribing to the channel, find me on the other platforms so that we can connect. We can have a chat. I would love to see you there. Now, whether you get your news from Instagram or you get your news from YouTube, make sure that you're subscribed to both so that you're the first to know when a video drops. I still have a few more reviews coming in March, y'all. I'm churning them out. So please stay tuned. Keep your eyes peeled. We've got more artists to highlight. We've got more stories to tell. Thank you so much for watching my review. I'm so happy that you're here, and it means the world to me that you're helping me to live my dream. Wishing you Black love and starlight. Stay shining, y'all.